All right, I think we're live any second now. There it is. Yeah, and my audio is working properly. So, hello, welcome to this very special discussion with GeorgeMC, the creator of the just released first battle pack for Red Thunder's Fire and Rubble module. George, say hello.
Oh, sorry, yeah, you cut out there. Hi, how's it going? George Mac here.
All right, and Domfluff, the admin of the Comet Mission fan Discord server. All right, he just says hello. The battle pack features two campaigns which are set in the late summer of 1944 in eastern Poland. There is a link to the Battlefront store in the description. George, as creator of the Battle Pack, what was it that drew you towards these campaigns in particular?
Uh, yeah, well, I think the genesis of it was putting together a campaign that was inspired, excuse me, by Douglas Nash's Kampfgut Mullenkamp. There's a series of photographs in there, and there's quite a lot of detail. So I started out working up a series of scenarios that were based around some of the events that were illustrated within the book, and then that became a campaign. And then a wee while after, I was invited by Steve to basically put together a battle pack. And because I'd spent a bit of time looking at what was going on at that part of Poland at that time, there was a lot of quite intense armored combat, and it seemed to be that would make quite a good theme for putting together a battle pack, because it would give them all a particular context and a time frame, and it had quite a lot of information, quite a lot of tactical level detail about a lot of engagement, so it would make it a bit easier to translate things to a combat mission sort of theme.
That's cool.
Out of interest, George, the you obviously did this. The battle pack now requires fire and rubble.
Yeah.
Um, fire and rubble's development was very delayed. So how did that fit in the time frame?
I did lots of reloading core units.
Yes.
There was a yeah there was the way things work. If there's generally you can change behaviors, but if there's a change to tables, organization, equipment, that can break things. And we had a few things where that stuff was broken. So yeah, that meant there was a lot of going back and forward and having to redo stuff. I also then sort of put it on hold for a little while because I got sidetracked into putting together some scenarios for the fan rubber module, and then I got invited into the Cold War group. So then I got a wee bit distracted by Cold War, and then I came back to the Second World War. So there was a lot of things were out with my control because it's part of the development in terms of what was associated with the Fire and Rubble module. There was other stuff of other projects, and then there was other timelines and stuff. And then came COVID, so that was quite handy because I suddenly had a bit more spare time than I normally have. So I managed to go a bit more full steam ahead with putting stuff together for that. So there was a silver lining to the pandemic from my point of view.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's kind of the same here as well. Um, okay. What research did you do as part of the creation for the battle pack? Any books, or were there any documentaries or anything you were looking at, or did you contact anyone in particular?
Aye, well, I think I've got to give a shout out to Mr. Douglas Nash because he's been really helpful. I ended up contacting him about some bits and pieces. I discovered there were some discrepancies with timelines to do with a series of actions that involved Flugel's second battalion. He ended up commanding them in August. In the context of that conversation, he was really helpful and gave me a whole heap of stuff, clarified stuff, and that was on the back of his book that was sort of released, which was that trilogy, the Fourth SS Panzer Corps. Um, that there was that book. There's a whole heap of stuff, and there's lots of things I had to like read between the edges. There's lots of stuff online. I think most of the books that are referenced are usually in the designer notes. So I've tried where I can to cite the sources and stuff. There's certainly for a lot of the Soviet things, there's more and more is on like the interesting stuff, which is primary source materials online. So I used a lot of that, and that suddenly there's a whole load of stuff that was available. And although I don't read or speak Russian, but with various sort of translating devices, it's possible to get reasonably good translations of stuff to sort of give you a working knowledge. The other person I should mention is Hugh Davey, who's been involved with Combat Mission for a while. He's actually doing a history degree, but he does have a bit of a command of Russian, and he was really useful for translating some of the Soviet after action accounts that relate to the action at Rakov. And that gave me quite a lot of detail from the other side of the hill about what the Soviets saw, what was going on around Rakov compared to the accounts I had from the Germans. So what I've tried to do is basically get accounts from both sides. And it was interesting trying to reconcile what one side was saying and what the other side was saying, because none of them really reconciled as you'd probably expect. But it was interesting to see where the differences were, but occasionally where they did sort of back each other up. Yeah, just interesting to get that little bit of an insight into an event that from both sides.
There's an anecdote I've actually mentioned before, but there's an anecdote I really like about that. It's one that's in Phil Saban's Simulating War book. But there's a chap called Dave Parnham who produced two war games on Stalingrad in 1980, which is Streets of Stalingrad and Battle for Stalingrad. And he did a lot of research for himself, did a lot of research on things there, and in his research, unlike the common accepted account of the time, he didn't have the German 76th Division being in Stalingrad at all, when this was something that it was on all the histories. But so in his game he didn't have it, and so a lot of other games then copied him because it's all fairly incestuous and the thing. And so you had this discrepancy between the histories and the wargame histories of the same situation. And it wasn't until 2009 with Glantz where he did his own research and discovered that actually he was right. And it's just there's a whole 30-year gap where the state of the art of wargaming was ahead of the state of the art of history, which is just amazing. But yeah.
Yeah, well, there's the one that we picked up was Flugel got the Knight's Cross for an action that I can't, the exact date was probably around about the 10th or 11th of August, I think it was, and so Trang in his history of the Viking division had this timeline where Flugel goes dancing off to this village, Stanislav, I think that's how maybe you pronounce it. But they went away dancing off down there. They did what they did there and then came. And then next thing they're driving like 60 kilometers across the axis of a Soviet corps attack to end up in the village of Yasnichka. And I thought that's not right. How did they manage that? And I spent ages trying to measuring distances and thought, but there's no way they could have gone right at right angles to like this. Like they'd just been driving over Soviet infantry left, right, centre. And so, but it was in the original citation. The actual primary source citation gave that date. And so this was one of the things I got in touch with Douglas Nash about. And anyway, the long and the short of it is the date in the citation was incorrect. So somebody, when they put the citation up, wrote the wrong date in, and that's what then came. And then Trang, when he was doing his book, obviously fitted that date in with the timeline, and then shifted the actual action to about 6 or 7 days later. So and so that's been. I think there's a website where they've got Knight's Cross holders, and they've updated. Although they haven't changed the primary source, but they've mentioned that the date in the primary source is wrong. So yeah, a typo by some staff secretary or something. Yeah,
That's
just
a
left
good one,
these.
all right. That's actually pretty cool. Just like being able to find that sort of discrepancies when you're just working on a computer game, It's when you're looking into the historical record.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll put things on. There's an Eastern Front forum on Facebook and stuff, and yeah, and everybody confirmed. Yeah, well, he's definitely at Stanislavov, I think they pronounce it, and
I
but
think he was
that's
upset about fighting Polish people, but yes, it's fine.
yeah. I do apologise. Yeah, yeah, it was around about the 9th and 10th of August. So, but the other interesting thing, and I guess I'm slightly going off at a wee bit of a tangent. The thing that interests me is the stories that aren't told because is it Yul Klapdor who wrote the combat history of the Panzer Regiment in Viking? And he based most of that of the war diaries. He doesn't mention anything about Flugel getting awarded the Knight's Cross for that action. It's not there in the book, and you just thought like, and but when you read the account of it, it's quite it's quite an interesting sort of situation in terms of what they ended up doing in terms of heading down there, launch a counter attack, and kicking the Soviets out. It was a bit of a elastic defence type thing. And obviously got the Knights. That's what he got the Knights Cross for. But that there's no mention of that at all in Clapdor's book, which I do wonder why something like that, which you'd think if you're writing the history of your regiment, one of your guys getting a Knight's Cross would be something you'd probably want,
Yeah,
big up.
sure.
Yeah, but no, there's no mention of it. So always wonder what personality clashes were going on in the background there.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd be surprised. Yeah, reading back through history, it's fascinating how many screw ups are caused just by personality conflicts between senior level commanders. Like you have the classic one of Cannae with the two Roman consuls just keep crossing the river. Uh, and eventually get one of them just they're just crossing they're both together at the same time, and they're both sitting in the same, they're both in the army, they're co-commanding the army, but they're commanding the army on separate days, and then so each day one believed they should be on one side of the river and the other believed they should be on the other side of the river, and every day he'd march, the commander would march his on it when he was in charge, he would have the army march to the other side of the river, and it was just it's just mind-boggling that they would do all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
Just
and that seems to be similar of what the Germans were doing about in 44. There was, I mean, I think Douglas Nash's book, that Fourth SS Panzer Corps is quite an interesting. I think what makes it quite different is he's got quite a focus at the staff level about what was happening at that corps level and what the corps commander and how the corps functioned, and the amount of like basically personality clashes or egos between Gale and his Wehrmacht opposites that basically were completely screwing up what both sides were attempting to do. And you thought you're facing an existential threat here, and all you're doing is squabbling amongst yourselves. It's really bizarre. Like it almost is like flat out undermining each other to make it possible. Like well, making them fail, or at least making their jobs a lot more difficult. So, and it's basically down to personalities. That's what
yeah,
seems to come down.
wasn't it? Was during like towards the end of the war in the east? Uh, wasn't it? Was it Zhukov and Konev, and they were ordering artillery barrages on the opposite their opposite numbers vanguard in order to slow them down because one of them wanted to reach Berlin or something before the other. I think it was, which is kind of
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
there you go. Okay. Back to the sort of gamey things. When
Sorry.
when you want to design a campaign, what what kind of work do you do? What's the process you go through when you're just when you what makes you choose a particular campaign, and then how do you go about creating it and crafting it?
You're right. I think the research stuff is. I think that's one of the things is trying to find something that's maybe got a little bit of a theme, and it's often difficult finding events where you can link stuff together. I mean, if you're trying to base it on a historical thing, is like I'm not trying to base stuff over years is quite difficult. So I've always tried to focus on something that's a shorter time frame because you can keep the like you're not going to get much in the way of resupply of lots of fresh units in. So it's basically it's to try and recreate what was like for or to give you an indication what it's like for a commander, where this is your command. If it all goes to that shit, then that's it, game over for you, sort of thing. So finding events like that, so that was handy with Kampfgruppe Mullenkampf, the book about, which primarily was focused around the SPW battalion and the second battalion, the Panther battalion, because that's all that Viking had that were ready to get like pushed into the line. So they ended up basically, that was only elements of the division that were available at the time, so they threw them in. And the advantage there was I had lots of good detail, everything from photos of what the terrain was like to reasonably detailed accounts, both from the German and Soviet sides, about the actual units that were involved and the areas that they were. So that gave me a good timeline. I could research all the detail, and then it's just a question of trying to pick your fights, as it were. I think because there's a lot of it wouldn't really translate that well to combat mission, and so it's like cherry picking the ones that you could string together as part of a coherent storyline that involve the main units you want to focus on. Because I didn't want to recreate the whole of the Viking division.
No. Do you
Um,
think you're more focused on the narrative or the themes?
oh, that's a good question. I like stories. So,
Yep.
right, okay, so I'll come clean. I know everybody doesn't like big long briefings, but it gives me an opportunity to exercise the sort of novelist inside me who's struggling to get out, the untalented novelist. I quite like creating, quite like creating that story, and the themes is a good one. So in terms of like, I'm I really am quite interested in sort of armored mechanized combat. That's the thing that I'm quite interested in. It's that, I don't know. It's the idea you've got these all that metal work and then all these squishes inside. It's that interaction. So having that as a theme, having a narrative that I can and can bring personalities a bit into it as well. I'm quite interested in that. I think what one of the things is like almost trying to humanize what is effectively like a massive battle, a massive war of extermination. I mean, that's the only way you could, only way I can categorize the combat on the German Russian and the German Soviet front. It was a war of extermination. One side was going to win and it pretty much exterminate the other, and therefore to try and put an idea there was people involved in that, and like human beings and with names and stuff. I think it's quite an interesting way to partly to give it a bit of a human angle, really.
Yeah, that's a good one, all right. So, when it comes to okay, so when you're trying to create when you're looking at the campaign and you're going through you're designing the scenarios for those campaigns. Like, are you looking for particular decision points when you're trying to like that or decisive moments in it, or are you just kind of trying to create a sense of what was happening during the campaign?
Yeah, I think more a sense of what happened in the campaign. I think the decision points sort of arise, and certainly with the 5 days 1 summer campaign, is if you if the German player does well in every action, they'll be on the historical timeline, and they don't really face too many decisions because that's the way that it all worked out. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening on the sides that you don't necessarily know at the time. But if you do well in your little bit of the sector, then you contributed to the success overall. But if you start not doing so well, then you start going into other branches where you do get to have a little bit of ownership in what you then choose to do. So you can, if you think things have gone, although you're another um, pathway, if things have gone well for you, you might choose to press home the attack because that might convey certain advantages, or you might decide that I haven't really done so well there. I'm maybe going to, halt here and wait for my buddies to catch up with me, and then we'll carry on. But knowing full well that also gives the Soviets time. So I think in the historical timeline, there's not many decisions to be made apart from do your best and win. But when you go into the alternate pathways, and you maybe get a little bit more ownership of how things might turn out, you know.
Do you think the emphasis on that kind of narrativism and storytelling would lead you towards having campaigns that are easier, perhaps, or like campaigns you're going to see more of? Do you think there's a pressure there to like you want to show the story rather than necessarily to your maybe that your emphasis is not necessarily on the challenge or the puzzle solving?
Yeah, the challenge is quite a. It's really hard to work that out. Like for me, I'm too immersed in the weeds. I mean, I basically run through as part of the whole design process. I play each scenario umpteen times. So I'm not playing it in the way I would play it if I was playing cold against AI, and I'm definitely not playing it the way I'd play against another human. Um, so my perception of sometimes what I think are really hard when playtesters get them, sometimes they just like inevitably there's always going to be one who just blasts right through something that I thought was nigh impossible because I'd failed miserably at it umpteen times. And then yeah, somebody just goes storming straight through. Oh yeah, two guys got killed. You know, I'm going.
Yeah.
I got annihilated. So I really do struggle that I can never really quite fathom how some. I think that's going to be hard, but inevitably somebody will tell me, "Nah, it's not that bad." And you've got to fight. Are you just some sort of combat mission Jedi, or is it really I'm just crap? But I think definitely a few, there's definitely a few combat mission Jedi's on the beta testing team. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm not going to name names, but they're yeah. Well, there's one keeps popping up on PBMs. I'm ruining the day that I'm going to meet him because I'm going to cross swords with him on a PBM. I'm just going to get slaughtered. You know, I'm dead before we even play. I think so. Yeah, but yeah. So yeah, trying to work out the challenge is quite hard. I think it'll be interesting to see how the wider public deal with things. I think within the campaign there are some that are easier, not that you're just gonna you can get away with just being lazy. You're gonna have to work, but they're not going to be some like Kobayashi Maru sort of problem.
No.
If you do good, if you approach it in a sort of reasonably competent way in terms of terrain analysis, and then apply textbook tactics, you'll probably do pretty well. Whereas other ones, you're really going to have to pull out all the stops to do well. And I think having a bit of a mix. The one thing I've tried to do within the campaign is not punt anybody out for losing stuff. So regardless of what happens, you can still stay within the campaign. Obviously, if you lose everything, there's probably not much point. But I do give people who maybe are finding on the outer reaches of these branches a little bit more in the way of help and stuff.
I mean, I think the operational context helps to an extent there, because nobody like in context, nobody's like isolated or strung out or it's not like it's not even like the Soviet campaign in Cold War where you are this regiment and this regiment is going to take losses and you're not going to get them back and then that's your job. You know, it's I think it's a bit more flexible than that from both sides really.
Yeah,
Yeah. I've only started the campaign myself, so I have all this to look forward to. I've just been really busy the last several couple of weeks. So I finally have the opportunity to start playing it soon, hopefully.
yeah. I'm not going to give any spoilers, so I'm not going to go into things in any detail because yeah, I mean, I think within the 5 days one, there's a reasonable range of challenges. I think would be a good way to put it. And some of them are big maps with big forces, and some of them are smaller scale affairs. So yeah, and I think it gives a bit of a balance when like it's not just super huge maps with lots of units. There's like interspersed with little actions, as it were. So
Yeah, no, I've seen some of the ARs that some people have done on the fan Discord server. There was one in particular that really caught my eye. It was like somebody had to capture a bridge that was out of town, and he managed to sneak his forces through a wood or something like that. He had a firefight to take control off the bridge, and then he defeated a counterattack. But it was only a small fight. It was only like a reinforced platoon-sized force thereabouts, with
That
a few tanks. Like just listening to it was just just reading it was fascinating.
yeah, that's Paul. I'm going to murder Russian. Palacia Diasteva. Oh dear. Anyway, that one. It's a small Soviet sort of combat reconnaissance patrol. So tanks, some scout cars, I think, white scout cars. So handful of tanks and some scout cars. Yeah, and it's interesting that one of the beta testers found that route, and I never closed. I could have closed it down, but I never bothered because I thought, well, that's actually pretty neat terrain reconnaissance
Yes.
because no surprises, no my playtest. All I did was I charged through the centre of town, so it looked like a bit of it was a really crap version of Black Hawk Down, really, for me. So as everything started going, exploding. But trying to go through centre town is really good fun. So if you've done the sneaky ninja, if you found that approach, which there are civil AI plans, so it doesn't mean to say that every time you try that it will go to plan. So there's a wee. There's, I didn't shut it down, but I maybe made it. It could be a little bit more awkward if
Yeah,
you pull the wrong AI plan.
that's good.
Now the other thing that highlighted was yeah, preserve locations. It's something I've got a wee snagging list, and the idea that I made it preserve location, which affects the terrain underneath, was that the Soviets do have a lot of firepower, like if they manage it. And what I was maybe trying to avoid was the Soviets sort of lining everything up and then just blasting their way to victory. So blasting your way to victory, particularly if the Germans are still in position around the bridge, isn't probably going to work out as you intend because it's a preserve objective. So there was a little bit of thought just to make it a little bit harder for the Soviet player, but I maybe need to make that a bit more explicit about how preserve objectives work for sure.
Yeah,
Yes, it's certainly not clear. I think I don't think it's your fault. I think that's more of a CM engine thing. It's a bit subtle.
there
Yeah,
was something you want to talk about regarding the use of artillery in combat mission, wasn't there, Tom?
Sure. So, what's it? Do you want to go into that, or do you want to go more into scenario design in general at this point?
Um, Maybe we'll stick with the scenario design. We can just punt
Because
the artillery to later.
I think,
Actually, I was probably
'cause
jumping in a
I
bit too
think,
soon with that.
yeah, because I think artillery is a useful discussion to have, and I think it's a very interesting discussion to have. But I think it's probably worth the thing. So yeah, so obviously we mostly were talking about campaign design and sort of narrative and things. So I'm actually really curious how. So I said before that I think that George is probably the most consistently good scenario creator. There are a lot of very good scenario creators and campaign makers in the CM community. There's a lot of people, and there are a lot of very, very good scenarios out there. But I think, for my money at least, I think George's scenarios are probably just consistently good, and certainly above average across the board, which is really good.
thank you.
I'm really curious about what you think when you're going into scenario design, because it is something of a black art, and it is something which is in any kind of game design, in any kind of thing, is extremely hard to get right. But you seem to do it quite well.
Um,
So
yeah, perfect practice is for my other job. How to get good at stuff. I spent a long time in. I mean, combat missions. I've had a few forays into other stuff, but combat missions, all its iterations, the one I've got spent the most time in. My initial forays, I basically just grabbed somebody's scenario and just started mucking around in the editor. That was the old CMBB, Combat Mission One.
mhm.
In terms of now, if somebody was getting into the newer engine, I think I think I think the thing that can undo you is starting out quite big because there's a lot of things happen and the map design. There's lots of different elements. You've got the creating a map that works for you, and there's a lot of factors that feed into that. Then you've got selecting your force that's going to work on that map, and then you've got the AI plans and other briefings and stuff, and that can be a lot overwhelming when you look at the whole package. So the easiest thing I like starting it from the first days was just taking somebody's existing scenario and then tweaking stuff. So it could be swapping out units or just changing the map a little bit and seeing what impact that has. But if folk are going to start from scratch, I'd say definitely keep it small, and less is more. I think like the AI is not going to play like a human being, no matter how much you will it to. It won't, because there's limitations with how AI plans work. And so the best you can do is, I think I'm sure we've maybe chatted about this before, is like an impression that there's like somebody's thought about something, so it looks the part. It might be easy,
Yes.
but if the enemy comes at you with a reasonably tactically correct formation in a way that's sort of reflects the doctrine, then it will feel like you're actually playing somebody, even though they might just head to their deaths, But
I mean,
that,
AI design in all fields is really about is really more about hiding the stupid than about it looking
yeah,
clever. Um,
that's a good,
mm.
that's good.
And yeah, absolutely. It needs to look as though, I think any AI plan in CM needs to look as though there's a concept behind it. It doesn't necessarily need to be successful even, but at least that there's some level of thought, and it's not just I'm going to charge you with my multi teams,
Yeah,
Alice Rascal.
I think there's heaps of trial and error. I mean, I must admit, like, I'm in and out in the editor. I'm in and out from the 2D to 3D, and I'm playing like, I do lots of testing things as I go. And I think that's the thing. You've got to you work in sections and you go in and out, in and out. That tabbing in and out of 2D to 3D, I think, is quite crucial, because if you don't, you can end up with a whole load of things that aren't quite working, and that can be a bit overwhelming to try and it just feels like it's broken. And
So,
so maybe yeah.
If
so
it,
I
uh,
go on.
uh,
No, go on.
if you had a top 10, if you had a top two things you would really like to see in the scenario editor, George, what would you like? If you could name
Well,
two things, or even just one.
well, I'll go for two things. Right, the sort of I'd like conditional triggers, a bit more than what we have. They work, but I
Yeah,
want a little bit more nuance with maybe tying to particular things happening, and a wee bit more granularity over the times. That would be something. Um, like being able to do more in the 3D view would be good. I mean, just purchasing and placing flavor objects would save a huge amount of effort. If you could have like a wee thing that came up and you just bought them there and just plunk them down. I end up having to buy like I plant a field of flavor objects close by to where I want them, and then I just spend ages shifting, cutting them and putting them into where I want them. So
AI plans in 3D would be a tremendous lifesaver. Yeah.
oh yeah. I mean, being able to do more in 3D, just paint things on would be perfect. Yeah. It saves my eyesight looking at all these little numbers trying to work out where depressions are and things like that, and then you've got to check in the 3D view that they're actually sitting right in that little depression rather than on the edge of it or whatever. So yeah,
Michael, a lesson in the chat. He has another question as well, but he's after commenting about triggers that put units on the map as well. So like spawning AI reinforcements or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
that would be good. Is to bring something on if you hit a particular bit, then something else comes in. Yeah, because reinforcements aren't tied to triggers at the minute. So
I think
uh,
one thing I'd love to have more of, honestly, is more control over artillery, um, because it's extremely difficult to write an AI plan that coordinates with artillery that isn't on map, um, and the on map artillery is very limited. And if you can't coordinate properly with artillery, you really can't do an attack. So it's you're very restricted as to how you can do that. But we'll see.
Yeah, that's one of the things I definitely missed in the Heart of the Dying Sun was like the initial Soviet bombardment. That all goes, but then yeah, trying to get it so that it moves on. That just doesn't really happen. But I got close to an appreciation of it, but having a wee bit more control over when and where it fell would have helped.
Yeah. So you can tie it to triggers with area fire and on map stuff. So on map mortars can be used. You can have something where you are bombarding the location you're assaulting, and then have it stop when they get within 300 meters or something. Um, but it's only on map stuff, and it's therefore limited, and there's nothing necessarily stopping them being used elsewhere, and it's just like all kinds of other things. So scenarios in general. There are there's a lot of scenarios in CM. And again, they go up and down. There's lots of different approaches, lots of different focuses.
Yeah.
One thing that's really interesting to me is that a lot of the ones I tend to dislike tend to be more puzzle-like. Like they tend to have one solution. That solution doesn't necessarily have any connection to anything real, and it's very gamist an approach. It's very much like
Checkmate.
well, no, but like things like Advanced Squad Leader, it's that kind of level of that kind of mentality of how you approach something, which is very much about like from like hobby wargaming still, but certainly historically, used to have a lot of situations where you'd have an equal force, and then they'd fight. And there are still quite a few of those in competition, and a lot of things where you think so. Like a lot, your scenarios aren't. There's a lot of situations, like even something like armor attacks, which is a fairly set piece scenario for Shock Force. Um, Armor attacks has one or two sort of key lessons you're trying to learn. Like you need to identify the key terrain. You need to focus on taking the key terrain, and if you can take the key terrain, you can start unmapping the position and having it all work. But that doesn't feel like a puzzle to me. That feels more like a real thing, like an actual lesson to take away. How how do you think you avoid that? Because you do seem to manage it quite well.
Aye, thanks. I quite like arm attacks. I definitely pushed the combat mission Shock Force engine to absolute limit. I mind there was a lot of swearing at my laptop as it crashed and stuff. So I got very well. That's other thing. Starts scenario design. Save often, and save different versions. Yeah. So yeah, just so if you do screw things up, you can always go back to another version. But anyway, I think the terrain that you excuse me, I think that challenge comes from the terrain. And so that map in Armam Attacks was just a random bit of Syria that I clocked on. I'd got an old Soviet era map of Syria, and I was looking at one of the areas where the Shock Force backstory was sort of taking place. And there was this bit of terrain that stood out with these hills and a pass. I thought, well, that'd be quite interesting if you're trying to attack through there and somebody else is waiting on the other side. So that came from there because it looked like that would be a place you'd probably want to head up, and it'd also be a place where you'd be maybe trying to stop somebody. So I think the terrain works because then you're dealing with whatever the terrain's the problem in a way. It's how you make best use of the terrain. And so generally, I think one of the advantages of doing sort of historical, semi-historical stuff is that the terrain's there for you. Like certainly a lot of the scenarios in the battle pack are based on real life places. So you're facing the same sort of challenges that the guys there were facing, which is how they use that terrain to counter whatever's coming the other end, the other side. So I think that's probably how I
So
generally avoid that. Yeah.
do you think that's do you think that works then? Because the focus is on because you're putting the player in the shoes of the commander, and they're forced to think about the same things rather than think about points or flashing objectives. That they are having to do things like IPB, or they're having to do proper analysis or face those kind of challenges.
Yeah, yeah, I would hope so. I mean, you then overlay. Yeah, I think the challenge is how you overlay the points, and that can yeah, it's how you do that and then make it reasonable what they're going to do. Sometimes there might only be one place they've got to head to, but they've got a wide range of options of how they're going to get there, and equally the other side's got a wide range of options of maybe trying to decide where the most likely attack's going to come. But yeah, but sometimes it can get a little bit screwed up if you don't quite get the objectives right. If they've got to have some meaning to what the action's trying to convey, and that's always the hardest thing. Because funnily enough, these sort of combat reports don't tell you they were aiming for that objective.
No.
It was worth 1,000 points. You've
Oh,
sort of got to try and discern what's the wider thing. The interest, are they trying to, if they're going to seize something, that's really easy. If they're attacking to
of course,
like capture a hill or a crossroads, that's easy. Just plonk a big green splodge down there and give it a load of points. But like the reconnaissance ones, I think, that Grey Fox was doing, it was, I put lots of things there that like ultimately they're there to reconnoitre the route, but that sort of put the player into quite a bit of a straitjacket, and so I attempted to give them a few other options
Hmm.
because you would do, and I wanted them to, okay, there's an obvious route, but there's other ways to probably skin this guy.
So
Yeah.
we've talked before about the reconnaissance scenarios, which again is a technique I haven't seen anybody else use. But it's the idea of having those scenarios where you're getting points for spotting the enemy, and you're losing points for being spotted. Um, and what I find fascinating about that, and it ties in, I think, to the AI plans and how you're doing something credible, is that you're having to you're like there's cat and mouse in the Mass Pack where you end up doing these I end up find myself setting up these little ambushes, and these sort of rolling ambushes where I was using the terrain, and I was having to scout properly and rely on sound contacts, and I had to make assumptions and guess at where things would be, so I could set myself up in a situation so that I could ambush, take out a load before they knew I was there, and then move on. And I think that's enormously clever. But I do think that creates that technique. I think is a manages to create a particular feel or a particular sort of concept, which an awful lot of sort of reconnaissance scenarios and things just tend not to do. I just yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I sort of discovered that a bit by accident, and that was I was doing Kampfgruppe von Scheuch, and there's a wee action there that I reckon by the time they got to there, they like the main force that I plonked down in the map could probably not look as good as it looked at in the unblemished scenario. So the way I did it was I did basically dump the rest of the command in there as a reinforcement, but I put a spot objective on them. So if the player decided to use them, they came at a cost, because one of the things was,
Yes.
it's got information that actually that all the German armored units in this sector were right there, just in this little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was the sort of backstory, and then but we're playing around with that. I thought, well, that's quite a handy wee thing, and I wonder, how you'd make that work, both in reconnaissance and stuff. So there's been a lot of playing around with it, and I think the cat and mouse scenario, if I remind, if I recall correctly, that sort of works in that premise where basically the German player is trying to, find out what's on the map, and the Soviet player is trying not to let them know what's on the map, but also you've got to try and stop them before they get too much. So
It's a really interesting balance because you can't just run away. Right? So it is it really is about having these sort of ambushes and whatever, and choosing when to commit. And I certainly remember running through the first time. I remember running through situations where I had set something up, and then they went the other way or something, and it's a question of, well, I can't pull the trigger on this because it's just going to go horribly wrong.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. It's actually based on that's an account in Totenkopf's the Panzer Regiment's war diary. It's effectively what they did. I mean, they got isolated by Soviet attacks and they ended up sort of effectively, and that's what the term they used in the war diary, playing cat and mouse with the enemy.
hmm
Work out where exactly they were because they were sort of one attack had failed with quite a few losses, and they were sort of pinned down a bit because the Soviet infantry had just infiltrated either sides of them there, so they were sort of having to keep moving and try and spot where the enemy were to basically stay alive really.
So I probably my four favourite scenarios in the campaign, which I do want to press you on. Um, the three tutorial, the trilogy of tutorial scenarios you did, which I think are fantastic, and then the one that's based on the Panzer Grenadier training film, which in many ways is a fourth scenario. I feel like thematically it feels like the graduation course after the first three.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about those and where they came from and what they were doing?
Yeah. So I think the main thing was that fighting with SPWs in combat mission is can be an exercise in frustration because of various things that happen with the game engine. I think MG gunners getting plonked, and then when they get nailed, somebody leaps up and takes a place and promptly gets nailed, and you can lose like a whole section in like a game turn because somebody's leapt up to man the machine gun. And so it was basically trying to they came in later on really to try and maybe prevent too much player frustration with the game engine. So taking them through, this is how SPW were used. So here's what real life would suggest, but this is how it adapts to the sort of combat mission area. And I think it's thanks to yourself, Dom, was all kudos to you for pressing to actually have the lessons, because I just basically created a series of scenarios. So having the sort of learning points as well, teaching points to be drawn out, I think is definitely made them more than they were, I think, and that's brilliant from that point of view. So yeah, so it's to let the player experiment, find out what the limitations of the game engine are, but also to try and use them in a way it's a bit more doctrinally correct for the time, at least what the Germans envisaged how they would use them. I'm not sure you'd always want to do the way the Germans suggested. I'm pretty certain they didn't either. So,
No.
but yeah,
So
and
on,
Mm.
go on.
yeah, no, sorry, on you go.
No, sir. Well, so on that point, the Panzer Grenadier training film, which is on YouTube and is there, and obviously you've recreated to an extent in the battle pack. You've said quite rightly that the it's quite optimistic. There's a lot of people doing very heroic things and doing whatever. I I agree. I do think that the lessons, the core elements of that film, I think are viable and practical, and I think do show quite well both in that scenario and combat in general. Um, but you do have to do a bit of reading between the lines. Clearly, in that scenario, you've added elements which are spoilers and things, but you've clearly added elements which are not in the original training film because the Soviets don't have any anti-tank weapons at all, apparently, and various other things. So what led to that development of that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, again, from like reading for the Soviet side of things, like they just it didn't seem to be that they would push off like a battalion of infantry onto objective with nothing, because the battalions had organic anti-tank weapons, V45mm anti-tank guns.
Yep.
So push comes to shove, they manhandle, they drag them into position, and they would be pretty much following the attack. Or if they're a bit flush, they might have a jeep or trucks that could just haul them in, or horses, But basically, as soon as they were on that position, they would have some anti-tank guns. They weren't short of tanks generally, so they might not have like a whole armored unit, but there would be some armor there. And so these things, I thought, rather than recreating a slightly optimistic training film, which you can still play at that, I thought, what would the Soviets actually do? So how might they approach this? What would they do to prevent the Germans doing what they would expect them to do, which is counterattack pretty much soon after with them, some armored reserves. So I guess it was to try and make it a bit more realistic from the Soviet side of things. And
So
yeah,
so I said it feels very much like the fourth training scenario, or it feels like the graduation for that reason, because I think the other training scenarios do a very good job of being a test, right? They're not necessarily the hardest scenarios in the pack, certainly, but they do have a. It's the kind of thing where if you lose them, you don't know what you're doing. I think it's a good test of the fundamentals, and then you can go on to things with more complexity and more whatever to that. Um, I think I've mentioned I have never used the um, the half track mortars or the half track flamethrowers as much as I have in those four scenarios. Um, both of which are much more useful than they normally would be. I think it's very
yeah,
effective.
the mortar half tracks are one of my favourites. That and the Stimmel, like the firepower that a Panzer Grenadier, armoured Panzer Grenadier company has is quite impressive. For if you can get them in the support without losing them to enemy anti-armor assets, and yeah, you've got quite a significant sort of game changer there with that firepower, where you can either have the mortars firing directly from cover, and you can move them very quickly into position, or even they can fire direct, because of the armor cover, the rees are a bit more protected. Although, as I discovered, that can be a high risk strategy, because if you haven't done the anti-tank guns, then yeah, they go boom quite a bit. So
So
yeah.
I think a lot of the training scenario 3, which really shows off the mortars in particular, I think the reason why that works quite so much is really the space. Like you have a large map for a relatively small force, that you've got long lines of sight, and you need you're engaging with people outside of effective machine gun range, which is not that usual in combat mission in general. It happens in Cold War, but it doesn't necessarily happen in a lot of titles. Certainly doesn't happen in Normandy, for example.
Yeah.
And so
I know. Sorry, carry on.
I was saying, just having the extra range of the mortars for HE, and then the smoke and the ability to shape and to support, and especially support elements which are mobile and need to be mobile in that scenario. Like they do gain an awful lot of utility by moving around and by being mounted, if you like. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I have got another Panzer Grenadier training film, which is not on YouTube, but and that shows the support elements being used. It's a lot more interesting that the Panzer Grenadier unit going in are driving from cover to cover, and the platoon commander frequently is getting out, going up to the next rise and scouting ahead. So what you're seeing is them doing effectively combat reconnaissance at a tactical level in an attack.
Hmm.
And what he's doing is he's going up, they're identifying targets, and then he's deciding how to engage them. And so the initial part of the attack is to drive through a bombardment. So they just drive hell mel through it, and then start using the plane to get in there, And it's and again, it's a bit, it's a best case scenario, but it's more interesting than the other one, that actually you're seeing quite a lot of neat sort of drills going on there, about how establishing a base of fire with that heavy platoon with the Stummel and the mortar half tracks, which are in cover, and then the mortar half tracks are engaging targets from in cover, and then the Stummel are used to move into to blast strong points. So it's a shame that one's not fetched up on YouTube, really, but yeah, it's good. There is a very optimistic picture where they get engaged by an anti-tank gun, and it punches a hole right through the front plate of the SPW between the driver and the radio operator, and they both look at each other going, "Oh, that was close." So yeah, That doesn't happen in combat mission.
Not often, no.
It's not on, as in it's you have it like on film or something like that. It's not on a computer.
Yeah, I've got on film on the computer. I bought it off a guy. It wasn't that much. It's a guy in Germany who. It's not the best recording. It sounds like it's been done in a hangar, and so the sound is pretty rubbish. But there's some interesting footage. It's not the whole film because the film's damaged. But there's bits of it. Even shows the ambulance section, like first aid, like the ambulance half track in action, and establishing a first aid post and how that would work. So it's a bit more than the classic one. It's a bit more at a platoon level, and how all the yeah, it's probably company, I guess, got all the different elements. But yeah, how it all it's more drill based, and this is how it works together.
Yeah, that's fierce interesting. Yeah, that is very interesting. All right, it'll be might be worth someone's time trying to digitize it and maybe if not clean up the audio, then at least translate it or provide
Well,
us a
I,
translation or something.
I can share the thing with you as a pal. I'll share you
Okay.
a copy of it and see what you think. Yeah.
All right. Cool.
I don't know about copyright. That's the thing to be careful of. So yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I
you
mean,
never know.
it's the copyright is likely to be with the Nazi government, so it's probably okay. Just probably right.
Yeah, that's likely.
But no,
Um,
no.
I don't think there's much threat there.
yeah.
Don't want to upset them. Um, do you think we're done with scenario design? Do you think that's a?
Uh,
Is there anything else on scenario design?
Yeah, no, is there anything you want to talk about scenario design that we haven't covered yet, George?
We touched a wee bit on AI plans. I mean, it might be worth a bit of a deeper dive into how that sort of works.
Yeah, you mentioned that you usually try to create several, is what you said. I believe the word was AI plans per scenario. Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about that.
Right. No, that's yeah. So um, AI plans. Yeah, I'm thinking how to do this. I think the biggest learning curve I had. This is thanks to Bill Hardenberger because he's a hard taskmaster, is that man? I tell you. But when they're doing Cold War, I did the AI plans for his NTC campaign. So he got me in that, and he'd drawn out all these absolutely beautiful pictures of what he wanted the AI to do, and basically, Jean-Luc Picard fashion, make it so number one. And by God, it really put me. I tell you, it was. But I did learn. I did learn quite a bit in that. And one of the things that I rejigged how I did completely did AI plans just partly because of the way he'd done stuff, but partly to try and keep track of things. And so I basically I use a Windows whiteboard and I put a screenshot with and then I can put a grid overlay on, and then basically I paint the position in the times on there. And what I tend to do is I try and work out what the key unit is. So I try and identify that somebody's going to be, there's a good chance there'll be a point element, and that's key. So I've got to work out how fast they're going to travel, and then work out who's, at what point are they going to blow up, and then you've got to work back from that to key off how the other units then move. And I've got to take into account that they might blow up later or they might blow up early and stuff. But what I try and do is get that opening. If I get the opening move of that unit working in a way that gives the impression it's a coordinated event, then that's fine, and everything else will come from that. And I tend to do that's where I'm in and out of the from the 2D to 3D. Like I'll go and load the scenario up enough to play through the first few minutes. So that's really there's nothing sexy about that. It's just grunt work. It's just you just got to watch the AI plan run and tweak things. But once you get the opening moves sorted in your timings, then everything tends to flow a little bit easier from that. And having things on a whiteboard where you can see where everything is at a particular time, when you start coordinating everything, it's a lot easier to work out times and who's keying off who and that sort of thing.
So one
Mm.
Well, one thing I find fascinating about that is that it's true in reality as well, but it's very like creating a course of action is a skill, um, but it's extremely difficult often to create a second course of action because you've already convinced yourself that this is clearly the way to do it, and you've already made the arguments and you've established why you can achieve this and why this unit can do this. What are the enablers that allow this to happen? You've already done all this stuff and laid it out, and then you've got to start again. You go, okay, well, what if I approach this as somebody completely different? And it's like it can be extremely difficult to have multiple plans, certainly.
Yeah, and that's where. So what I do, the game goes. So the beta testers just hammer one plan, because what I want to do is get a bomb-proof plan that works. And usually somebody will find a way to, sideswipe the AI plan. And that's fine, because what I'll then do is I'll copy and paste the plan to the second one, and I'll come up with a way, how can I prevent that sideswipe, or how can
Ah,
I mitigate the effect of it. So one AI plan will generally be the bog standard one, but then I'll create the subsequent plans. Will have various approaches to mitigate what players have done to sideswipe the AI plan. And if that works well, then I might end up copy and pasting that one back in and you know overwriting the first plan, because that maybe works better. So that's a good thing about copy and pasting plans, is because you've got a lot of slots here. You just got to make sure that that's my core plan. That doesn't get touched until I'm pretty confident that anything else that works. And then if I'm playing with anything else, I've got to make sure I switch that one off. Because what I'm not wanting testers to do is sometimes it's hard to work out which plan they've actually got. So I tend to make sure I get the core plan, switch that off, and then get them to play, the other plan. And that's one of the advantages of, I guess, when you're in Evolved Battlefront, is there's a superb team of beta testers who are really enthusiastic. So you've got loads of willing people to, kick the tires of your scenario, which is fantastic. Like, because that really fast tracks that whole design process. Otherwise, it can take ages to get a lot of feedback, and often you just got to release something and then maybe just keep updating things. That's why a lot of the stuff I've released on my own had gone through umpteen iterations, because it's just taken a few years to get that feedback to make changes. I think First Class is one of the ones that's gone through. Oh God, I think it's on about half a dozen versions now. Just because I got more player input into that one.
Cool. Um, what what's your favorite time period to be creating campaigns and stuff for? You've created campaigns for, or at least scenarios for, I think most of the Common Mission games, or maybe even all of them. What was your favorite one to work on? That was kind of a question from one of the viewers here. And if you have any other questions, please leave them in the chat.
Ooh, I think I've enjoyed them all, because they're all different. I think this one is, I've got a particular interest in the Eastern Front, and 94. I mean, previously I would have been probably more 42, 43. But the events this summer of 44, and I know more about it, and I think that's because there's more information there. That's definitely, I found that quite intriguing. But Cold War is definitely, I think that's been a massive learning curve, because you've got sort of comparatively modern tech, but sort sort of quite World War II. If that
Yeah,
might
I think
help.
Dom mentioned it before, when we were just like when we were chatting. You're you've got modern era weapons, but World War II era optics, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and that produces all sorts of interesting effects. So I think within, yeah, I'm not sure. I've enjoyed what I've been doing. I mean, I definitely like working the battle pack, and that whole so that narrow time period's been quite interesting to work with. I've enjoyed that, but I've enjoyed all the stuff like working on CMSF, because I was involved in that right from the very off, when it was just a basic beta game, where there was still working out models and stuff like that. That was really interesting being in that from the very beginning and try and get my head around modern stuff. And I thought, that type of warfare and what that would look like was quite interesting.
So you
Yeah.
have mentioned that. You mentioned earlier about the NTC campaign. Um, you have mentioned when we chatted previously about the battle pack that Cold War had quite a bit of influence on your thinking for the battle pack, particularly in terms of representation of artillery, which is something that is fairly common to skimp on in CM. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
So, like, what do you think? How do you think your thinking has changed, or what do you think you've learnt from doing Cold War that could be applied?
Yeah, I think it's the value of artillery, and actually, you don't have to be afraid of it. Well, not in game. I wouldn't like to be underneath one, but I think it doesn't. It helps. I think previously I thought of artillery as something that killed and destroyed stuff, and and it can do that, but really the way that one of the things from the Cold War that I find that I could use artillery was to shape the engagement area for the Soviets, because the problem that I had, there was some key terrain that the Americans, like if you're an American player, that's where I'm going to go because that's key terrain, and anybody comes along that, but I'm going to shoot them down. And I thought, well, I can't stop the American player doing that because they've got the ground, but how about just putting artillery there? It's not going to, yeah, it's unlikely it's going to destroy, it's not going to destroy tanks, but it just makes life a little bit uncomfortable, and you know, you're not really going to put units in where there's a load of artillery coming down. So I used the artillery then. We need to give the Soviets enough artillery to both to then engage opportunistically, although the time frame there's less hopes that was going to happen probably. So it was a case of just trying to put artillery down where the American player probably wanted to be, but without bombarding their setup zone. So, you know, it would be easy just to drop everything where the Yanks, the American units were. Players would probably not appreciate that. But I could drop stuff on places where the American player was thinking that's where I'm going to go to
Yeah.
and prevent them from
Yeah.
getting there.
When I did that myself, I made a beeline for that little ridge, and fortunately the artillery started landing before my troops arrived, so I didn't lose anyone to it. But it was well thought out. It was well thought out.
And so yeah, the artillery, that's part of. I mean, it can do a lot of damage, but you can also use it to shape things. And to do that, you need quite a lot. I mean, there's always a risk that players will just dump it all on where the enemy is. But then, yeah, you might create a wee hole, but you won't necessarily affect everything. So it's probably swings and roundabouts. But yeah, I guess I I, I wasn't afraid to use artillery then and use it in different ways. And again, that was partly with Bill's setup of the you know how the Russians might tackle this and stuff. And yeah,
Yeah, but Bill would have had I imagine, quite a sophisticated course of action laid out here.
it
Fires
was
type.
very detailed. I should show you the diagrams. Trying to like you want me to put that into an AI plan? Jesus.
So yeah, I've said before, I honestly do not know how to attack with a red battalion without at least three batteries of something. Um, it's you need it with the Soviets or things which are derived from the Soviets. They're so it's so central to everything they're doing that essentially skimping on that and giving you a platoon of mortars or something, just you just can't do it. There's no you're crippling them for no reason. It's yeah.
Yeah, I've got there's a scenario floating around out there that's for that test tournament that I put together, and the Soviets have got a heck of a lot of stuff for which would be quite interesting to see how that plays out with um, two two humans playing each other on it. So yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. Anything more on AI plans you want to discuss, or
I don't
anything?
think that unless anybody's got any questions about any specifics, but that's
Uh, well, I can take this from Rascal. What battlefields do you think combat missions should explore in the future?
Oh, in the future.
Uh,
Ooh.
uh,
Well,
what would you like to see in a game?
um, I'm definitely, yeah, God, like they've not already covered,
Uh,
and see him, and well, I mean, there's a desert, so uh, there's that. I mean, I'm a mechanized guy. That's my interest. So it would have to be Western Desert, um, but also I'm quite interested in operations 1942, 43 is quite a lot of big mobile ops and stuff like that.
oh
Um,
yeah,
yeah, 40, late summer 41. Yeah,
yeah,
I
that'd be
I think
interesting.
for my,
yeah. I mean,
for
I
my
did a whole lot of stuff in the old CMX1, then
oh yeah.
based around Stratford and stuff. And there was some, the Battle of Dubno and stuff like that. They would be quite interesting to see next to.
So I think for my money, like one thing I really appreciate about Italy is the fact you have 1943, and the fact that 1943 is so different to 1944 in character. Um, you have you can end up with uh, like it's fair like anti-tank guns and armored cars suddenly become dominant or suddenly become major elements because you just don't have necessarily as heavy armor or as much of it and everything else. And it's really interesting to see the different relationships you get there. Um, the early desert would be interesting because you have tanks which can be killed with machine guns, for example, or tanks armed with machine guns primarily. And there's a lot of potential subtlety and things in there. A lot of I've been reading the Pendulum of War recently, which is really good, and a lot of that's about Alamein and the build up and the various failures and disasters that led up to success, and that's it is really interesting to see how British doctrine developed in that context, and developed through failure often, uh, but ended up being very sophisticated and very how the artillery doctrine was tied together and the combined arms and everything else and how it was and yes, being able to see that in CM I think would be fascinating. So
Yeah,
for the Western Desert would be great. Yeah.
yeah. I've got sort of personal connections there because my granddad was with the 51st Highland Division, so he was at El Alamein. In fact, I've got his map
Oh wow.
from them that they were issued, and it's encrusted with dust and sand and
Oh
stuff
Wow.
amazing.
stashed away. And then there's a guy, one of my climbing heroes, Bill Murray, who's very well known in Scottish climbing circles. I met him at a Scottish Mountaineering Club dinner, and he'd been captured by a German tank. His position had been overrun. Most of his unit had been killed or wounded, and it was sort of early morning, and this tank rolls up, and he sort of puts his arms up as the commander gets out the vehicle, points his machine pistol at him, and Bill Murray says, "Oh, it's as cold as a mountain." And the guy looks at him and says, "Oh, you a climber?" And he says, "Yeah." "Oh, well, that's all right then." So this German tank commander then makes sure that he gets him out and stuff. So he Bill Murray, because turns out the German tank commander was a mountaineer himself. So Bill Murray thought that was going to get gunned down there because tanks take prisoners, and ended up in a prisoner of war camp. But yeah, so yeah, Western Desert for me has got quite a bit of a personal link, so that's why I'd be quite interested in that.
Yeah, going back to the fire plans, I remember reading one of the books by, I think it was James Holland, in his War in the West trilogy or series or whatever, where he's describing the Battle of El Alamein and how the artillery was fired and how it was. There was a BBC World News radio broadcast, and there were code words embedded in it, and they'd calculated the flight times of the artillery shells, so that when the BBC broadcaster was reading them out, they would not. He'd say a code word, and one battery would fire, and then he'd say another code word, and another battery would fire, and in order to get the simultaneous impacts, the time on target effect on the German positions. It was just fascinating reading that little tidbit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Other
a
than
level of planning and that sort of thing that always gets me. I know it's it's quite impressive, that coordination
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it didn't spring out automatically. It was hard won or hard lost. It's
Yeah.
a lot of trial and error.
Yeah.
And, and the other thing I'm actually genuinely really fascinated to see. Um, so obviously talk about Cold War. I really like Cold War. I think it was fantastic. Um, but partly because it really fits CM scale. Like a CM 4x4 map is perfect for Cold War for the ranges and the engagement ranges that you can do. Whereas it might be even the maximum size might be a little bit too small for like Shock Force or something. But the thing in particular is when the various NATO powers had quite different doctrines in the Cold War, and possibly more different than they did any other time. And I'm going to be really fascinated if and when we get, British forces and German forces, West German forces, um, and to have that kind of thing laid out, and to see the difference in how different blue sides fight. I think it's going to make it
Mm.
really fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've watched quite a few of the British Army and the Rhine training films and stuff. So
Oh
yeah,
yes.
that's
Yes. So I was actually reading. There's an essay. I've got to look around the Discord somewhere, but it's an essay from that John Curry. He's a academic. He does the history of wargaming project. Um, he did an essay on how the British Army fought based on his own personal experience, um, which is probably one of the best outlines I've ever read of how that works on a CM scale. Um, and I think it's really dense. It's really short, but it's a very concise, um, very clear way of essentially how you do that, and why it's different.
yeah. Yeah, there'll be. I'm looking forward to all that coming out. So fingers crossed that it's on track. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to hit the SS question?
Yeah. No.
All right.
Wait. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Go
So
for it.
this is a difficult one, and it was something I'd suggested we see if we could tackle, maybe a bit outside the realms of this, but uh, so the SS, as we know, is this god awful organization that was just the worst elements of humanity and with the worst goals imaginable and the worst ethics imaginable. But naturally enough, being combat mission, being involved, do most of the combat mission games, or at least half of them so far, have been involved in World War II, and most have had the depictions of the SS in all of them, as far as I'm aware. Um, how can you, how do you sensitively handle that? Right, have you had any posed any problems for you? I remember you said you were you'd read a book about it and you were interested in discussing that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I think that I'm under no illusions what what the SS were and, as an organisation, and the Waffen SS were an extension of that. I think handing it censor. So maybe the I think there's a lot of myth for sure, and I'm sure we're all aware of that. That elite units and stuff, and I think in wargaming, and I can mind when I was playing with 1300 micro armor stuff that if there were SS units, they immediately got you know like various added values to dice throws and stuff like that, and things, and really when looking at it, um, when you're doing the research and I guess like looking at Viking and stuff, that's not the case really. Like there were various things about the training that made particular differences. Unit cohesion would probably be the main one, which is also why they didn't last long a lot of the time. So, so trying to set the combat values is probably one of the things. Like it's very easy to suddenly have, oh well, it's an SS unit, so they should all be elite. Well, that's not really by how it worked out. They weren't like a bunch of sort of special forces ninjas or anything like that. But the one thing that I could discern was there were a few individuals who maybe survived long enough that that were quite competent. There was a lot of people who didn't. And so with the unit things, like if you look at the unit values in the Viking unit, that's probably a good example of a snapshot of an of a division. They had a bit of a kick in the winter of '44. Like there's no, and basically most of the Panzer Grenadier units had been effectively wiped out, to all intents and purposes. So once you get into spring of '44, they're trying to rebuild them and stuff, and one of the things that then came out is when they then sent the units into action, was that the one unit, the Panzer unit, certainly the 2nd Battalion, seemed to have comparatively, I'm not saying unscathed, but they hadn't suffered catastrophic losses. So the Panther Battalion was actually, like, enough of the personnel there had survived to become pretty competent as a sort of tank crew and stuff like that. But the Panzer Grenadier units were basically, like, gutted. And so what they're trying to do is train all these new recruits up. And I think there's various accounts that this was the last time they could probably put all these guys through this sort of the training program that they've been through. And one of the things that made them that created that unit cohesion was indoctrination. There's no two ways about it. They were the whole process of training was to create a particular attitude and an approach to combat and fighting. And so when these guys then went into action, and there's a combat report that noted they were very, what's the word, committed, but they were they weren't very tactically competent, was pretty much what they said. So after the end of August into early September, most of the Panzer Grenadier units had been effectively again wiped out, because although they were, very fanatical, would stay the ground, they weren't very, they weren't as technically adept. And then when you look at the wider picture of the SS, then you can't get away from all the other things that go on behind. I think of all the divisions, the Viking is probably the less controversial, but it's not without controversy. Certainly with the other ones, certainly Totenkopf and Leibstandarte and Das Reich and stuff, I've got a pretty, and then that period I've got, shall we say, quite a track record of war crimes and other stuff.
Yeah.
I mentioned anybody who's wanting a bit of an in-depth look into what the background of the SS is should track down Philip Blood, Dr. Philip Blood. He did a couple of presentations for World War II TV, and that'll leave you under no illusions what the SS was. I think he refers to it as a death cult at every level. And so when back to saying, this is quite a bit of long rambling, but I apologise. But going back to sensitivity, it's keeping in mind that they're not Aryan supermen, and it's back to that humanising this element of combat, that there's people there, personalities with politics and a whole approach to what they're doing that I don't agree with and find it abhorrent. But I find it useful to try and look at the people behind it as well. I think it's, I guess, trying to deal with the nuance and stuff, that it's very easy to think everybody is monsters and stuff, but if you realise that they're people, it becomes it's more scarier that they're ordinary, potential ordinary people who then go through a system that makes them what they are, and I find that scarier than just the idea of inherent evil.
Yeah.
But people who, given the right, different circumstances would, if you think Germany pre-war and stuff, and right through, like through some of the 20s and 30s was not that sort of place. There were things going on, but what the Nazis did in the system they created, and the SS were basically the instrument to further that and defend it, then yeah,
Yeah.
it's a bit of a poor taste. But looking at the combat side of things, as I say, it's modelling a particular historical episode, and the SS, because of the SS units were that sort of fire brigade that were then used and destroyed to basically try and solve a problem that Hitler's policies had created. So yeah,
I
Yeah.
do think I think it's a fascinating problem, and it's something which has been with wargaming as long as wargaming has existed. Um, I think honestly, I think Battlefront's approach has been remarkable, and has been unusually good, unusually nuanced in general. And I think, and obviously, things like this battle pack are part of that. Um, but it is interesting to see, especially if you look at sort of wargaming in the 70s and the 80s. An awful lot of it is very much tied the into the myths and into the myths which were often derived from Nazi memoirs, who were written by people who were interested in serving their own careers, or writing their own myths, or making themselves look good fundamentally, or not as
Yeah.
bad.
What was it? I
And
read someone saying before. The World War II, the War in the East, is the first one that was where the loser won the history of the war, at least in the English language.
yeah, totally. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I think Hughes, it's something that, yeah, absolutely. The fact that yes, SS units just used to be the best, and there were whole games where it was very much the Soviet hordes against the small elite Germans and whatever. Um, and in fact, they went through a long period where essentially the way to get better sales of your war game was to put an SS soldier on the cover, which is why there's an awful lot of Avalon Hill games that have an SS soldier on the cover, and it, it's it's fascinating because it would be easy to not depict that kind of thing at all. It'd be a very easy choice to just completely not do that, and and they don't, and that's an interesting choice. Common mission is not covered in swastikas, right? It's not covered in hate symbols. It's not dwelling on. It's not in any way glorifying or idolizing or anything else. Um, but it still makes the choice to depict the SS as a fighting unit, and that is not a normal. That's not necessarily the easiest choice. Certainly, I don't think it's even necessarily the average choice, and I do think it's interesting that that's where they've ended up.
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing that the whole wider issue about even with the Heeren stuff, with the Wehrmacht, and again with Philip Blood stuff, like basically everybody had their hands involved in some part of the whole Nazi process, which is why they were in the East. They were all there to, it was all part of furthering these Lebensraum and stuff. Um, but the interesting, I think there's one of the things that band in the camp film that Philip Blood talks about, which is bandit hunting. What was a way of blooding? It was a way of use creating combat conditions where there was less risk to the protagonist. So they use the term bandits. So they were sometimes fighting partisans, but more often not, what they were doing was trying to track down groups of Jews who'd fled from the various villages and stuff, and that's fundamentally what they were doing. Like round Bialystok in the woods and things there, they were basically patrolling and trying to round up or eliminate these groups of people, civilians who were desperately trying to escape the camps and or just being executed. So it's quite chilling. I do struggle with that. Like I found that a bit harder to read now. I've got a wee girl because there's that the whole genocide side of things I find a lot harder to contemplate and read because of the awfulness of it all. But I don't think you can do stuff in combat mission with SS and not be aware that that's fundamentally what they're fighting for. That you know that's that's part of the plan. It's it's not about it's it's something a bit bit darker and a bit more anti-human, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's depressing.
Yeah, I was going to say on a brighter note. I'm not sure, but I think one of the things I've tried to do, and it's not always successful, but I think, and I'm not sure the Soviets are entirely an unblemished political system, but and particularly, the Russian stuff. But I think there was always a side that like there was always quite a German heavy approach, and one of the things that's been good over the last 10 years or so is access to Soviet records and stuff from that period, and the Caris in Malinava was one I was quite pleased about, as I managed to track down a Soviet casualty list. So all the tank crews, the guys who were killed in that action. So, and Caris is one, with the ambusher unit and stuff. I managed to track down a Soviet account which actually had all the individuals who'd been killed there, and that was quite. I was quite not pleased is the word, but it just seemed that it was a good balance that to give these men their names and that they were there. Otherwise, it's a bit of reminiscent what Dom was saying, the Soviet horde. That they were the actual individuals, and they were a newly trained group that were still pretty green and just found themselves at the wrong place at the wrong time, really.
Okay. So I think I've run out of questions. I don't see any. Oh, Dom or Rascal or Dom or George. We have a question from Mihai Rusu. What would be some great books you can recommend, either about, say, Red Thunder or in general?
Um, so I'll let Dom go first because he's probably got some off the top of his head. I think.
Well, I think you'd be remiss not to recommend from Realm of a Dying Sun, surely, and
Yeah,
Douglas Ash's books. I mean, that's a good place to start.
Yeah. What was it? If you want to learn, not necessarily about the tactics and the strategy of the war, but Adam 2's Wages of Destruction, yeah, I thought was fascinating. Like it's a long enough book. It's quite dry. I read it during my undergrad and when I was doing economics, and it was just he just went through like the basically the economy of the Nazi regime, and how that contrasted with some of the other powers, both east and west. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, but it might be a bit more data heavy or whatever you want, not necessarily about sweeping operational maneuvers or anything like that.
yeah, I think just going back to Dom's thing there, I think that understanding the wider the context that the German army is fighting within, and certainly both the Western and Eastern front, so that the economics and the industrial support was problematic for what they were trying to do. I think Dying Sun, the thing that makes that a little bit different is it's all primary sources that Douglas Nash is using, and it is, I think it's from the German side, but he's got quite a lot of the resources there. But it gives you a good insight into staff work. So, like, there's a lot of stuff there about how a core staff would work, and it was surprising that the SS never really had probably indicative of the sort of slightly chaotic nature. They didn't have a way of training staff officers. They had a complete lack of them, so they had to sort of piggyback a little bit on using the Wehrmacht system, but also bringing in Wehrmacht staff officers to support the grunt work of how the staff operated. Yeah, so there's
Mm.
quite interesting insights here into that whole process of setting up a Panzer Corps from scratch, because the box wants one, wants an SS one. Yeah.
So was there a theory as to why, or was it just that it was essentially a new formation, so it didn't have the years of experience built in?
Yeah, they just it was a new, comparatively new formation. They just didn't have enough. I think there's a combination of not having the system geared up to generate that number of officers. There was combat wastage, so they were short of, generally officers tended to end up going straight to the front. So there's a whole series of factors, all of which meant there was a shortage of suitable officers. And so when you're trying to set up a whole new staff, a whole new organisation, it was a bit of big borrowing steel, really, including even radio units and stuff. They just didn't have. Somebody decided it was a good idea, and but there was no thought given to the resourcing it, or whether they had the resources without stealing the resources from somebody else. And I think that part of that was at the root of the antagonism between between Gale and his staff and the superiors he was working with in the army groups and stuff. So yeah, but it's a good insight, and talk about personalities. I think Douglas Nash does that really well and drawn out these conflicts and between the various sort of principal characters there. And it's also interesting about like what they were actually trying to pull off in the face of quite significant Soviet assaults. Really, it's quite an interesting exercise in operational defence and fighting withdrawals and stuff. So there's a lot in there, and it's not very data dense as well. So it's a cracking read as well.
Okay. Rinaldi in the comments is talking about George Knipe's decision. Ukraine is good. He says it's magisterial, a bit dry at times, but has some of the clearest breakdowns of what Maskarovka actually meant in process. Michael Lesson also recommends Last Victory in Russia by the same author, George Knipes.
Oh yeah, that's just that's a good one. That's worth tracking down. I can't quite see my books. They're all around the side there and in the dark at the minute. I'm in, but yeah.
If you want some pop history as well, I mentioned it earlier. James Holland's War in the West books are they're actually very nice, very good. Yeah, I really enjoyed them. Yeah, and if you want to talk about naval war, John Parshall and Anthony Tully's Shattered Sword is a great book about the Battle of Midway.
Yeah, if you want something from the Soviet side, there's a good one about a Soviet dude who was riding around in Sherman tanks, and I can't find the thing.
Okay. I haven't done so much reading on the Soviet side. I've read some Glance. I've stumbled in Colossus. Very dry. Very dry. There's so many numbers of division names. Gosh, it's like 20th, 25th, 16th, 18th. And he lists out the division, each corps, and or each army. Oh my God. It just keeps going on and on. But it's fascinating at the same time.
Yeah, the one I was talking about is commanding the Red Army's Sherman tanks. So that's what it says in the tin, but it's quite interesting. It's quite a tactical level book, and it's interesting how they used the Shermans and what they thought of them. So because I referenced that quite a bit. In fact, some of the the scenarios that I've geared to be more played from the Soviet side are based heavily on some of the accounts in that book.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's right. Robert Cicino. I've read some of his books. Death of the Wehrmacht, the German campaigns of 1942. I've read the one he did about 1943, and I have the last one as well. But no, actually, I'm waiting for that to arrive. But yeah, Robert Cicino is quite very readable. Very readable books. Okay. Well, if there's anything else you guys want to discuss, or is there anything you guys want to discuss?
Um,
Or do you think we've covered everything we think we can reasonably?
oh yeah, there was just I guess just a bit of a flavour thing. Rakov, the Rakov scenario.
Okay.
Aye, there was that appears. That's probably quite well known because it appears in a wee pamphlet titled "Small Unit Actions" during the German campaign in Russia. and there's quite a detailed account in that. And this is one that Hugh Davey did a bit of translating Soviet ARs. But the German account, which was given to the American military about this is how you deal with these Ruskies, was really detailed and really vivid and really quite short on facts. So
Yes.
when I dug into it, I thought, oh, that sounds really familiar because I found an account in Armoured Bears of an attack that sounded really, really similar and like, but lots of things were different. And it turns out that what these guys had done was they'd embellished an actual action with quite a lot of embellishment and made it more successful than it actually was. They conveniently omitted the massive punishing Soviet artillery bombardments that stopped any further advance in its tracks. But that was quite an interesting one to track down because I had this what looked like a primary source, small unit actions. I had the actual accounts from some of the individuals who participated in Armoured Bears. There was a section in fire brigades, which is the Bible bit, the Panzer divisions. If you're willing to sell kidneys to buy it, always go for these books when they first come out because they might be a bit heavy, but God, yeah. He's working on a revised version, I think. But yeah, but trying to match all that up was quite an interesting exercise and timelines. And I think what I got in terms of account was probably as close to be able to get about what the actual event was and how it panned out. And interestingly is how players tend to play it is how players play it ties up with what the Russian accounts say the Germans did, but
Interesting.
it's not what the Germans say they did.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I found that scenario fascinating. It's another one where you have quite a large map, quite a long, thin map, and a relatively small force. And so you're having to focus very much on your approach and how you're going to your march order and how you're going to actually fight when you get there. So you really have to think quite a few steps in advance, which is a bit unusual. Because yeah, I think I ran through that 2 or 3 times in the testing of that and did it different ways. It was really interesting to see how they went and how the air plans are operating as well. Because I think yeah, you can gain quite a bit from sound contacts and decent reconnaissance and trying to work out how you approach it. I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, I think that's one of my favourite ones. That part because yeah, the situation it presents you with, but also all the digging around. That was it was quite an interesting bit of research for that one for sure.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating if the player accounts are matching the Soviet accounts. I think that's really interesting. I think that's because I mean, like you're right. Like terrain will dictate an awful lot of course of action and how things are going to play out inevitably. Um, and so if you're presented with the same problem or the same terrain or very similar terrain as a German player, you're probably going to end up doing something which is recognizable. And that's yeah, it's interesting if that's vastly different to the German accounts of the problem.
Yeah, I know the
Mm.
German accounts is a little bit more. We aggressively attacked. We got a bit pinned, but then we boldly stormed the bridge and won the day, sort of thing. But you read between the lines, and that's not. There's a little bit more happened there. There's a bit vague in it, but the Soviet accounts are pretty clear about where the German armor came from and what happened. And when you see players playing it, that's what they do because you can try bouncing the bridge, and it's possible, um, but it becomes a harder action, and there are other options are available,
Yes, yes, indeed.
and it's other options that players eventually usually take that then mirror what the Soviets said that the Germans actually did. Yeah.
I remember quite. There's at least one or two fairly mean things you did in that scenario as well, which was quite a thing. Which again, honestly, may not have been you. It may just been the Soviets, but it was certainly there were certainly some nasty surprises.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they did have some nasty surprises. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, we've been going for an hour and 3/4 now at this point, I think. I really enjoyed it. Have you guys enjoyed it?
Uh,
I hope so.
yeah. It's been
Great.
brilliant. Yeah, I've
All
really,
right.
yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone for watching and leaving comments and likes and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Um, I just want to thank both you guys for showing up, Dom and George. And yeah, thanks very much for coming, and I hope it wasn't a burden.
No, not at all. And thank you very much for making this happen. It's been brilliant. Yeah, we should do more of this, I think.
It's my first time doing something like this. So, lots of teething problems. Like I really enjoyed just working up the video and everything to have playing in the background. That was a few hours of effort, anyways. It was just yeah, but it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed organizing this with you guys, and yeah, it was fun.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Graham.
we should have us play something, play a wee thing in real time, and then have like a peanut gallery, you know?
Yeah. All right.
I don't know how well, split screens and stuff, but
That's
yeah.
it. All right. So I'll just end the stream now. Thanks, guys, for watching. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, or leave comments as well if you have any suggestions for future stuff, or if you'd like to see anything like this. So I hope you guys have a good evening. I'll just end the stream now.